Welcome to Fantasy Awash with Laura and Josh. We just finished episode 5 of The Rings of Power.
Called Partings.
Partings. Lots of partings going on. What would you rate this episode?
A 4 or a 5. Not great. How about you?
That's generous. I
Yeah.
was thinking about a 2 to a 3.
This was not a good episode.
This was a bad episode. And it's a shame because this is the first clunker that this series has had.
I didn't love last week's, so this is 2 episodes in a row for me that have not been very good.
I did like last week's episode, but I think you will also acknowledge last week, while maybe not up to your standards, was still a step up from this episode.
It was. We just watched an hour and 12 minutes of nothing happening.
We watched an hour and 12 minutes of scenes that were really short, which, as I've said before, I don't like when the directors and the writers force us into 20, 30, 40-second attention spans. Trust the audience to have an attention span longer than your little short vignettes you're showing us. This episode had a level of silliness that belied the seriousness of the situation. Things were happening this episode for no reason. They were happening just because we needed plot to move along. And lastly, we continued the ballad of great Galadriel, who even in a moment of despair, even in pointing out a problem with herself, still uses that problem to get what she wants because we have an untouchable main character that is really boring.
I don't think she's likable, and she was highly passive aggressive in this episode. And it's one of those things that I've been kind of giving her a pass over the last few episodes, going, okay, maybe the character will begin to evolve. But I've mentioned it a few times now where I feel like she's a petulant teenager, which is just not something that is super endearing to the supposed main character of your story and heroine of your story.
She's like a petulant teenager that comes from a trust fund family because she always gets what she wants despite being petulant.
Let's start at the beginning though, before we fully get into it. So we see the Harfoots, who we haven't really seen all that much of. And I gotta say, I wasn't really missing them. I feel like we get it. They are a prehistoric version of hobbits and they are migrating. Great.
We knew we were going to get a scene, which I know comes later, but I'm just going to mention it now. The whole point of their story this episode was to show that Mystery Man has magic. We knew we were going to get a scene like that.
But that was something we already knew. It's not riveting.
Exactly. We knew that. There was going to be a scene, at least I felt, eventually there was going to be, it was exceedingly predictable. There was going to be a danger presented to Nori and her compatriots, and he was going to save the day with magic.
Yeah, and I mean, like I said, we knew that he had some aspect of magic already based on the scene with the fireflies and the fact that he is, swirled fire. But I am starting to get more into your camp that I do not think it's Gandalf and I think it's Saruman.
I'm really hoping it's Saruman because let's just skip ahead and talk about his story.
Yeah.
When he yells at one point, it sounds like Saruman when he's having the wizard duel with Gandalf. Listen to the yell that Mystery Man gives out, and then go watch the duel with Gandalf from the Fellowship of the Ring movie. It sounds the same.
So, continue. I'm sorry.
I just want to say, though, I'm also hopeful that it's Saruman because I would love to see a character that we know in the end is evil, but is a shade of gray. Give Saruman give him a role, give him an ability to show a good side as well, because we know from the books and from Gandalf's dialogue in the movie that at one point Saruman was a very respectable and respected leader.
There's a lot going on with this in the sense that we start the story where Nori is describing to him things that are predators to Harfoots, big people being one of them, which he then worries that, is he a bad guy? It shows that this figure is learning a sense of right and wrong and morality and wants to be considered good, doesn't want to be considered harmful. Sure, that's all great. But the thing that for me that really stuck out is he keeps having the vision of his landing, which is a very clear symbol of the eye. And I'm wondering if this is a predetermined thing that Saruman sees the eye, is drawn to Sauron from the very beginning. He can't fight it. It's in the essence of his being. And the whole notion of predestination is something that is very much a pivotal story in the Silmarillion. So I understand that they can't really fully touch on upon that in this universe. But Iluvatar, who is the creator of everything, is essentially a figure that has predetermined when things will happen, how they will happen, and people don't really have much say. So it would be interesting if the character and the very nature of Saruman is inherently good, but he can't fight what has been predetermined for him, and that's kind of the origin story, and it's happening here.
And it would be interesting too if we had a character that tried to fight against that.
Yeah, it would be really
So
interesting.
hopefully, I'm hopeful that that's how they go with this character. But thus far, the entire storyline has been exceedingly predictable.
I agree. I found overall most of this episode to be highly predictable, which is always irritating. The one thing that I did not find predictable involved Durin, and we will get to that later.
Though unpredictability does not have to occur at every point. We don't need to have surprises that don't make sense with the plot.
Agreed.
But at the same time, you don't want every storyline to be exactly what you thought it was going to be for every
No,
scene.
you want some things that are easy for some watchers to keep up with. You don't want every aspect of your show to be really confusing and maze like for them, but you want some twists and turns in your story, and you don't want everything to be super straightforward. So if it does turn out that the stranger is Gandalf, I won't be surprised. It would be pretty basic at this point. If it does turn out to be Saruman, that would be awesome. But one thing I thought a bit was going on for too long was the song that Nori's friend was singing and showing them on the map and all the places that they were traveling to. The one aspect of the song I liked was that the song seemed to be titled Not All Those Who Wander Are Lost, which is, of course, a famous quote by Tolkien. So that was nice. But beyond that, I wasn't super interested in much going on with them.
I got a lot of vibes from this episode of Indiana Jones. And Indiana Jones is
Which
spectacular. Well, any of them, but let's just say the first one, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Indiana Jones is great. There's a level of silliness in there, and Indiana Jones has the scenes where he's flying and it traces along on the map. And this when
I see what you're saying.
and when she was singing, they were doing the same thing, which at the time I thought, that's like Indiana Jones. But later we get into some other things where I think that there's a silliness factor in this episode that just was not appropriate for some of these storylines.
I agree. So from them, we move on to Adar, whose face I still don't quite understand how
By
it
the
got that
way,
way.
we also go to the impact crater.
We do go
And
to
we
the impact
have
crater, and we have
mystery person.
mystery priests, maybe? Do they look priest-like? Kind of? Guardians?
There's potential as to who the main person could be. I don't think that we have been introduced to this character in any of the formats, the Silmarillion or the books yet. I think this is going to be a new character.
Okay. A lot of speculation, as I was saying to Josh, was that this blonde figure was Sauron. And people went nuts for it because in the Silmarillion, Sauron was described as being fair of skin and having blonde hair. So people saw a pale white person with blonde hair and went, oh, that must be Sauron. And of course, everyone lost their minds on the internet.
Don't make the bad guy of the entire story look like one of James Earl Jones's sidekicks from Conan the Barbarian. It looks like someone that's in his camp in Conan. It's a great movie, but it's too silly to have that be your main bad
Which
guy.
I don't think that is going to be the main bad guy. I think if anything, if we do see Sauron this season at all, it's going to be in the last episode. I am not anticipating to see him in the middle of the show, but
there are those who also think Mystery Man is Sauron.
There are those that think that. I'm not of that camp, but one of the things that's interesting, and we've talked about Numenor extensively because it is such a key part of the show, but Sauron is present on Numenor when it is swallowed by the sea. So it is possible that one of the characters that we meet on Numenor is in fact Sauron. And it's possible that it could be this figure of Kemen, who is trying to persuade Pharazôn to not follow the queen and branch out. But What did we think going back a little bit with the scene of Bronwyn and Theo and Adar?
So it's very interesting. One of the four main critiques, I will say, from this episode that I had is that things happen for no reason.
Yeah.
So we see Bronwyn in this episode beginning as exceedingly steadfast.
Yeah.
She's going to stay and she's going to fight, knowing there's an army of bloodthirsty orcs coming at her. Keep that in mind for later in the episode when something different happens for plot.
it I am not a fan of Bronwyn. I haven't liked her from the beginning. I think I've been pretty vocal about that. And I just don't care about her storyline at all. I have zero interest in her and Arondir. I have a bit more interest with Theo, but that's it. I find that the character kind of just lacks depth. Yes, she's this supposed caretaker. She's a descendant of the people who sided with Morgoth. Sure, we get it. But beyond that, what is she actually offering? Nothing. They haven't explored anything further with her character. It's been 5 episodes of knowing that she's the mother of Theo, she's the love interest of Arondir, and she heals people. Okay. And by the way, she beheaded an orc. So we see that in one half of the episode, she's kind of sticking to that narrative that, yes, I'm going to go against my ancestors. I'm going to stick up for humans. Humans are great. And then at the end of the episode, it goes, no, things are hard. So I'm not going to do that. We're going to revert back to how our ancestors were. And that's fine. It made
Well,
no sense to me.
but Laura, you're forgetting she saw carving.
Which was also so convenient.
Thank God that the elf knew that the carving was behind the conveniently placed single piece of ivy that when ivy grows to rock, it is hard to pull off. But I
It
guess
was very easy
super
in
elf
this.
strength, and he pulls one piece and it all it's happened to fall off. It's absurd. The Bronwyn character then completely shifted for absolutely no reason. I know there's going to be some people that say, well, she saw the sword and she saw the carving and it reminded her of the story she heard and it took all hope from her. No, you the plot was created in such a way that they needed the plot to turn at that point. And so they just had the character change. There was no direct reason for it in the story.
I agree. It just felt so absolutely ludicrous. I know this sword, and we just happen to be in the exact place in which this carving
He wasn't
is.
in the exact place. He took at least 3 steps to his left.
Excuse me, 3 steps to the left, and it's been hiding here for however long. But in the 200 years it took me to become courageous, I remember seeing that carving. I don't know. It just felt really redundant to me and really unnecessary. And I was so curious after last week's episode, hoping that this week would be more fulfilling for me and that we would get some answers surrounding maybe what the sword is, who it belongs to. I've talked about that I think maybe it's the origin of the ring wraiths. And we got none of that other than this weird carving into a wall.
And once again, as well, something that we've touched on is don't recycle characters, don't recycle storylines from the original trilogy. And the tower is giving me crazy Helm's Deep vibes.
Yeah.
It's giving me, and there's going to be a force of new Norians on their way to save the day. In terms of Arondir speaking with Theo, it's Aragorn speaking with the kid whose father was Hama, whose father was bitten in the head by a warg earlier in that movie. It gave me really Helm's Deepish vibes, and if the episode was better, I would ignore that. But the episode seemed to lack a level of creativity and a level of skill in writing to make the plot happen organically. And so because of that, I think it's fair criticism to say that it seems like they're recycling a basic Helm's Deep feel for the tower.
We'll be back to the episode after this short break. Hey, Josh.
What's up?
Have you thought of something new that you might want to watch or read?
I haven't.
Well, we have a great list of recommendations in our show notes, so everyone, including you, can find them there.
Sounds great. I'll check it out now.
Let's get back to the episode. So I feel like we've been kind of ragging on a lot of the things that we didn't like about this episode. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the things that I did like about this episode. There were a couple of sets that really stood out to me. I loved the candle wall that Halbrand stands in front of.
The moment we saw that candle wall, all I saw out of the corner of my eye was Laura vigorously writing. So I was just waiting for her to talk about that candle wall.
I really liked it. I thought it was a cool setup. I have a favorite set for each episode, and for this episode, for me, it was the dinner scene between Durin, Elrond, and the High King,
which is very similar to your favorite set from the first episode in the graveyard,
which we saw again in this episode. And all of the Alvin sets, I feel, are astoundingly beautiful. But the highlights for me this episode, in terms of sets, story, characters, everything, Durin and Elrond, without question. It's at this point the only plot that I find myself really interested in. I really like the character of Elendil, and I found that Isildur's story this episode was a bit more interesting, especially because I was rewatching The Fellowship of the Ring earlier today. But I found myself sitting there watching, thinking, I'm not super interested in the Harfoots. Galadriel, I found, was just obnoxious. And then Arondir and Bronwyn, predictable. So the only plot that I found myself going, yep, I'm into this part of the story, was Durin and Elrond.
I have to disagree. It's a preference thing, but I was not into that plot. So first there was a touch. Oh my God. How could you give it a 4 and I give it a 2? The one thing of that plot that I did have direct issue with was the end, when we're talking about the death or exile of the entire elven race, but we had to make it a little silly again with Durin joking around with whose hands.
I don't see anything wrong with that scene, because it re-emphasizes, I think, this notion that dwarves like to be in control and have everything, and he's a dwarf, so it makes perfect sense to me.
I get it. It's if the episode had a different vibe overall, I would have felt differently about that. But the episode had a little bit too much silliness at times when it should. What was with, by the way, I feel like, because I've mentioned a few times, the Indiana Jones music, basically that same kind of silly adventure music, was playing in the useless sparring scene where Galadriel decided she needed to kick a bunch of boys' asses.
That scene was not good. There's been a scene, pretty much one scene per episode, that I have felt has been absolutely ridiculous, and it's usually focused around Galadriel. The first episode was, of course, her jumping into the water. We then had that episode of her on the horses on the beach with Elendil, which they did in this like slow motion thing for a really long time and was super awkward. And this one stands out to me as being part of that grouping.
And I'm asking, I think I know what the answer is. And I'm asking you, Laura, and I'm asking you, the awesome listener to our podcast. When has Galadriel said or done anything that hasn't been exactly right? She hasn't. This entire show, Galadriel has never once done anything wrong, said anything wrong. Yes, she had like a racist comment, but there was no consequence to that. In this episode, Galadriel and Halbrand, it was contrived. Halbrand tells her he's sorry, and she says, "I don't need your sorries, but I'm correct." And she admits she can't stop fighting, and that's her fault. But we know already from the viewership of the episode that she's right to not stop fighting, because Sauron exists and the evil is coming. So even her flaw is correct. Also, she tells a sob story, and then that transitions to Halbrand, and that transitions directly into saying how Halbrand needs to do his duty. And then, predictably, at the end of the episode, Halbrand, or as I like to call him, Halbraragorn, is on his horse in his armor, looking all the parts of a southern king, ready to board the boat.
She said, to be precise, was, "Your sorrow cannot ease my pain," because I also wrote that down because I thought it was absolutely ridiculous. And she was super passive aggressive.
But then uses that directly into convincing him to do what he needs to do because she's right. Galadriel is a character that is, I would say, the first few episodes was turning into, but now I think she's lodged directly in the boredom category. I think Galadriel is lodged directly in the category of boredom. We have a character that no matter what she says or does is right. And that's a really boring character to model a show after.
It can be. I mean, it's one of those things, if you look at that type of character, the closest figure, I think, in more recent film and fantasy is Sean Bean as Ned Stark. He is a character that is consistently right, but he's likable, he's honorable, and you want to punch him sometimes because he won't make the decision you want.
But the difference is Ned had a significant flaw. His flaw was he didn't understand politics. And so it's good to have a flaw. Galadriel has a flaw. She's arrogant. Now, is there a consequence to that flaw? Ned had a
No.
consequence. He got his head chopped off.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. This is the differentiating factor between the two of them. I think in that capacity, it was done well because there was a consequence for his ineptitude. For Galadriel, there isn't a consequence, at least until this point. But we know the end of Galadriel's story, so we know that it all turns out well for her in, 2,500 years.
And we know it turns out well for her very soon because Sauron's coming.
Sauron's coming. If we return back to where we were chronologically in the episode, where are we? What's going on?
So, okay, we've jumped around because there's been a lot of topics that have really they were bad. Let's be serious. We both agree that a lot of these scenes and a lot of the character development of this episode was bad. So we go back, if we're going chronologically.
I think we're in Numenor.
We're in Numenor. They have nice ships.
It kind of was giving me the catalog of ships vibes from the Iliad, even though there wasn't tons of them, but that was the vibe I was feeling.
And TGS sent 3 triremes.
Exactly. But one of the things, Pharazôn is becoming more prominent. I talked a bit about him in our last episode that I found him to be really obnoxious. And one of the things from the Silmarillion is that he does eventually overthrow the queen. He claims the control for himself and kind of leads Numenor to its destruction. So I think that we're starting to see the groundwork be laid for that, but not at first, because he actually probably had my favorite quote of the episode, which is, "The folly of youth is enough to make an old man weep," which I thought was really good. And they were kind of playing him up to initially be strong-willed and strong of character, but then you very quickly see, no, that's not the case. And he is conniving. He's not strong-willed. Morally not strong-willed.
I have to disagree with you. I think he's very strong-willed because I think a weak-willed person would bow to beliefs and the leadership of someone who they disagree with, whereas a strong-willed person, though they could still be wrong.
Yes, he is strong-willed. He is weak in moral character, I feel like. And
he wants power.
He wants power.
And he also, but I do think one thing I like about this character, and we'll see how well they do with this, he wants Numenor to be powerful. And whether that means he personally has power or not, it probably means he has power. But he seems to want to do well for his people, which, say what you will about him, at least that's a redeemable quality that he has.
So we see that he has this conversation with Kemen, who is openly racist. And we then flash to this conversation between the king and the queen. The king really looked like an older John Hurt, which then made me very sad that John Hurt is no longer alive and acting, and seems to have prophecies and is prophetic in some way, shape, or form. So do we think that when the king was in power and he touched the Palantir, that he maybe saw the death of his daughter in Middle Earth?
Perhaps. He certainly seemed to not want her to go.
Which is contradictory because she's going to technically help the elves, and he seemed to be quite supportive of the elves.
And fight Sauron.
What do we think of this freezing of the arm scene?
So again, he's using magic and he heals himself. Yes. So perhaps we're seeing that he has the ability to also heal. I don't know what to think about it. He hurts Nori a bit. It seems unintentional. And for Nori to see him in a trance, speaking a different language, and then doing what he did to her, it feels to me that if they make her distrust him because of that, that's her own stupid fault.
I kind of was having feelings of Dante's Inferno because this stranger has been associated with fire in the sense that he seems to create fire, things catch fire around him, fireflies die, and then he can now create ice, which also can burn in a different sense, but everything is revolving around burning, which I thought was kind of interesting. But one of the things I want to talk about is how much this show seems to be getting away with taking information from the Silmarillion, like straight up discussing Silmarils. And the one scene that I found I really liked the overall look of that wasn't based on a set was the story of the light being transferred into the tree. Did you like that scene?
I thought it was a good story, and I like the quick visual of taking us into the story for a moment.
It was a brief story. I kind of would have liked it to be longer, but I wonder if this is kind of where we're getting into
This
that legality.
this wasn't the episode for long scenes, hence why
No,
it wasn't good. One
it
of the
it
reasons.
definitely was not part of that. So, what are we thinking of the plot with the elves at this point?
It seems contrived that all of a sudden, after many, many centuries and millennia, suddenly the dwarves start mining mithril and the tree starts dying. So now we have a situation in which the dwarven and elven destinies are intertwined.
Yeah,
I don't get it.
it's very much trying to, in a way it's kind of answering a question from the Fellowship of the Ring, because when they get to the mines of Moria and they're walking through, Gandalf is explaining to the Fellowship that what destroyed the mine is that they kept digging too much for mithril. So it kind of makes it seem now at this point that Durin sacrifices his people for the elves. Whether or not that is in fact the case, that's sort of what they're implying.
Now, that did take place a long time after.
It did.
The storyline to me just seems contrived because, as far as I remember, in the Fellowship books, in The Hobbit, and in the movies, there's never any mention of somehow the elves need mithril to sustain themselves.
So the overarching story is that the elves cannot live in Middle Earth the way that they would in Valinor. Their life is just not sustainable. And the way that they are convinced is to don these rings, one of which Galadriel is then given, and her ring is made of mithril. And it helps sustain the elven communities, and without it, they will perish, which is essentially what he says to Durin at the end of the episode.
But that also doesn't make sense because in this episode, we heard that they need Celebrimbor says they need vast quantities of mithril. And if one person needed to have one ring per elven settlement, they wouldn't need that much.
No, you wouldn't think so. So it is going to be a little interesting to see how they incorporate it, what they do with it. Do they just start pounding the ground with mithril and go, now you live here and we all thrive and this is great? I don't know how that's going to work. Or do they start infusing the trees in the way that we saw in the story?
I don't understand why we're in a story about good versus evil, and suddenly now we're going into a story about Roman salt mines and their wars in Illyria over salt mines. There's some awkward resource war story that's now being crowbarred into a story of good versus evil. And now is Sauron going to somehow play the elven need of mithril against the dwarven desire for it? It doesn't feel right to me that this story's now in there, and we have to concern ourselves with the dwarven mining efforts for the elven people.
So the last character I want to really talk about for the episode is Isildur. Is he likable? Do we like Isildur? How do we feel about it? I think they're doing a better job at making him a more likable and relatable character.
And Isildur as a character should be, from what we knew of him before this show, should be likable. He was a good character. Isildur, we talked about this a few episodes ago when he was introduced. Until he fell victim to Sauron's will in the ring, which it's no small power locked in that ring, so it's hard to blame a guy for falling victim to that. He was a brave leader that fought the good fight.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I like that they're showing that he's human. Essentially, he wants to go onto this ship. He wants to take part. He wants to experience something new, but he does it in a sneaky way. And then he lies to his father. He has these negative traits about him. Meanwhile, he's still endearing, which I think is a good setup for the eventual Isildur that everyone knows from the Fellowship. I think it's very in keeping with humanistic traits.
I think the only character this episode that was really, I wouldn't say really interesting, but held some level of good development for me was Isildur.
I would have to agree. Everyone else kind of maintained where they were and or digressed. But I thought Isildur was headed in the right direction. So I thought that was good. Hopefully that'll continue to be the same thing and the rest of the characters will pick it up a little bit.
I just think it's really cool too that the Numenorians had a perfectly fitting set of elven Galadriel armor in their storage for
Well,
her
you
to
saw how
don.
quickly they were turning out swords.
Hey, it was great to have that awesome scene where she climbs aboard the boat looking full Galadriel. I just thought that was really neat of the Numenorians who have a set of elven female armor that fits her perfectly in their vaults.
So to wrap up our episode, what do we think of the preview for next week?
I think it looks again predictable. I don't like watching previews
I know.
because now we know, and spoiler alert, if you haven't already found out, we have spoilers in our podcast. We already see the Numenorians have linked up with the defenders of the tower. I thought what we were going to get was a Helm's Deep situation where the Numenorians show up in the nick of time and save the day. And there's different ways you can do that could be good or bad. But now that main plot point has been resolved. Okay, they show up, they join up.
Yeah, I'm curious to see. I'm hoping that the next episode will be better than the last two for me. But if you disagree with our opinions on this episode, we want to hear from you. Leave us a comment or write us at fantasyawash@gmail.com. We love to hear your comments and reviews. We would love a review, wouldn't we?
Yes,
5-star
we
reviews.
would. And hashtag Halbraragorn.
I mean, if that doesn't catch on, I don't know what will. But in all honesty, if you do like these types of episodes and content, we would very much value a review, especially on Apple. It makes it easier for people to find us. If you're listening to us on YouTube, we would gladly love for you to like and subscribe to our videos.
And if you're listening on YouTube, we would let us know if you disagree with us. We want to hear from you.
We really do want to hear from you. We like getting comments, even if they aren't the same feelings as us. We like to engage with our listeners. And as always, if you like these types of content, we will be back in a few days with our deep dive of House of the Dragon. And I feel kind of weird because initially I was so much more hyped for this.
The shows have switched. So going in, we were more hyped for House of the Dragon. As we said, the Wheel of Time series on Amazon completely ruined our expectations for Lord of the Rings. Then after the first few episodes, it switched and Lord of the Rings became the one we were looking forward to. And we were going to plod our way through House of the Dragon because it was terrible. And now in the last few episodes, it switched again. And House of the Dragon has turned good again. And Lord of the Rings, unfortunately, the last few episodes have taken a little bit of a dive. Well, if it took a dive last episode a bit and fell off the side of the cliff on this episode.
Hopefully it'll be climbing out of the deep end next week. But thank you as always, and we hope that you'll tune in next time. But we will see you in a few days with our next episode. See you then.